And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie. And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
And welcome to Mob Talk Radio. We are covering Carmine Persico today. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie, and this is the second show I've done today. First show is a Q&A where I answered all your questions, and that should be up. Once again, right at the top, you can follow us on Twitter at RealMobTalk7. You can check us out on YouTube at Mob Talk Radio. Just kind of type it in, like, subscribe, and share. Also, the True Crime page on Facebook. Look that up. That's Scott's page. He is my partner. I do some stuff on that page as well. Give him a like. Give him a shout out. You can check me out on Facebook at Mob Talk Radio. The page should be up. Like, subscribe, send hatred. Do whatever you want to do. That's how you can get directly in touch with me or Scott. If I can't get to you, Scott will definitely get to you. That's how you keep in touch with us. We got a big show today, Carmine the Snake Persico. Right off the bat, I'm going to tell you the truth. I know Carmine Persico personally. I don't want to go into necessarily how. Obviously, he's in prison. We know that. But I have communicated with him extensively in different areas, which I can safely prove, considering there's going to be those that are going to say that's not true, but it is. He's a very nice guy, a well-spoken guy, one of the most intelligent guys I've ever had the pleasure of discussing anything with. But also, he's called the Snake for a reason, and we're going to get into all of that. But before we get into that show, a couple of things I wanted to talk about. First, right at the top, I wanted to say congratulations to John Gotti III. He was fighting in Lincoln, Rhode Island last night, first pro MMA debut. And needless to say, I think Gotti was definitely a lion in a cage. Gets the TKO, first round. Everybody's happy. It's a great start to a very good career that's going to be happening for John Gotti III. Crowd was boisterous. I'm very proud of my hometown, Providence, Rhode Island, cheering the Gottis on, especially John Gotti III. It's a great start to a really good career. He looked really good, and I think he's going to stick around for a long time. He's a tough kid, very, very tough kid. Also happened on the 77th birthday of his grandfather, John Gotti Sr. So, all in all, yesterday was a good day for a lot of different people. So congrats to John Gotti Jr. III. And to everybody else that supports Team Gotti. As far as what's going on in the news, I said that in my Q&A I was sort of going to talk about this. Maybe I wasn't going to, but it was a pretty interesting week for me last week. I was in court, obviously, and I'm not going to go into really details. I sort of agreed to be a gentleman about certain stuff and not go into details. But the one thing I will say is that I've never, ever sat in front of a judge in my life and had somebody tell the judge I was in the mafia. That's got to be a new one. The crazy shit that comes out of people's mouth. It was absolutely sort of hilarious. I couldn't stop laughing. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I don't know what the attempt was there. Apparently I'm in the mafia. I'm in a crew. Boy, that's strange. I'm a radio show host. That's what I do. It's amazing the amount of bullshit you can say in a court of law and not get, held up to, excuse me, can you prove that? Nah, it's rumors, happenstance, and bullshit and drama, and I love it. I don't love it. I actually fucking hate it, but it shows the epitome of what people are willing to do to try to sway things, and it didn't work, and, that's how it is. Now, as far as Philadelphia goes, I don't want to sit here all day because it's basically the same thing that we've known all along. The problem now is it appears that really the FBI is really concerned with the testimony that John Rubio could give. So Joey's all in. All the chips are on the table. He's going all in. He's going to fight the government. Chances are that the scale is really tipped in his direction. The only thing that can change this, really honest to God, is if at the last minute they offer him like a 2-year plea deal. Then he might just say fuck it and take it. The other thing that the FBI apparently is trying to work on is they want another snitch. They want somebody else that can back up what Rubio is saying, and they definitely want somebody else to come forward and indict Merlino on a murder or something like that. But from what I understand from my sources, they're having a really hard time not getting the information, but it's having the people that give them the information go to court and testify. They're not willing to do that. So the FBI is getting information from the streets, from street guys, but it's not conducive enough for them to say, okay, now we got something. Now we're going to have you testify, and we're going to go after Merlino. It makes things very interesting. The Philadelphia was split essentially prior to this indictment into 4 factions. Joey had himself, and he had a crew underneath of him. Joe Lagambi, same deal. Philip Narducci and Joe Pungatore, same kind of deal. Now I'm understanding that right around after the indictments and everything, Joey pretty much closed shop. Now they're really functioning as 3, so Lagambi, Pungatore, and Narducci, which could be dangerous for Joey Merlino at the end of the day, only because if he goes away for 15 to 20 years, he's probably not going to be able to remain holding on control of that family. Lagambi definitely is too old to play those fucking kind of games. So I think the reality is what we are going to see, depending on this, what people don't understand about this is that the Merlino case is huge. If he goes away, what you're going to see is probably realistically Narducci and Pungatore take over. They're Scarfo era guys. It upset the apple cart when Joey Merlino brought them into the family because of the bad blood between the Merlinos and the Scarfos. But it was done as an olive branch. It upset the apple cart, but everybody seems to be falling in line. And I think realistically, Joey's going to have a hard time controlling Philadelphia from a jail cell for 20 years. His run will be effectively over at that point. Because that would effectively put him out of prison at 65, 70. So that's going to be a done deal if he goes away. If he walks, the natural assumption here is that there's going to be more indictments coming down from the FBI. They're really digging hard. I hate to use this reference. It's not a fair reference, but they don't call Joey Merlino the John Gotti of Passyunk Avenue for nothing. He hasn't been able to stay off the radar completely. And I'm not saying that they're alike in the sense of demeanor or character. I'm just simply saying that the comparison is there because of how much they're seen. So that's really going to create a problem for Joey. It's really going to create a problem for Philadelphia. The membership in Philadelphia is hovering like right around 70. So, we have started to see this, and we saw it recently in Queens. We even saw it in the Merlino indictment, 48, 49, 50 guys indicted. The problem is going to be if they indict 50 guys or 40 guys from Philadelphia, the crime family's over. There is nobody going to be left. And that's what's going to make things really interesting. We're not seeing RICO predicate acts. We're not seeing RICO indictments these days that only involve 2 people. Usually it involves 40 or more. If Philadelphia were to catch 40 indictments, they're done. They don't have the numbers to keep going. Granted, they have a lot of associates, but at the end of the day, a lot is going to hinge on what happens to Joey in court. If he walks, I think everything will be fine. He won't take a backseat, but he'll sort of disappear a little bit into the background, and it'll be business as usual in Philadelphia. The fact that George Anastasia can honestly sit there and say he has no idea who's running Philadelphia, he's out of his fucking mind. Everybody knows what's going on there. He recently did a Mob Talk Sit Down 8, imagine that name, where he talked to a rat on the streets. You know what? Rat information is the same as every other information you can get. It's half-truths and scenarios devised by somebody who probably isn't really that close to what is going on. But everything you hear from me about Philadelphia is accurate, 100%, guaranteed. And so just keep a watchful eye on Philadelphia. Like I said, if Joey goes away, this game is going to change in a hurry. You're going to see a lot of power vacuuming situation type of going on. There's going to be a power vacuum in Philadelphia if that happens. But if he doesn't go away, it's my belief that within a couple of months, you're going to see a massive sweeping indictment. A lot of people are talking, and the FBI wants Joey Merlino like they wanted John Gotti Jr. for all them years. They're relentless. They're not going to stop. And some of this is their own fault. Joey's loose lips. We got to admit it. Talking too much. Being around the wrong people. But most importantly, really besides all that, is the fact that Georgie Borghese opens up a social club on 11th and Jackson. When you do that, you're planting a flag in the middle of a fucking field saying, here we are, here we are, here we are. Probably not the brightest situation. Philadelphia consistently fights over 10 rackets. They've had to get involved in the legitimate rehab housing market because they're unable to make as much money. You see other guys buying restaurants. So Philadelphia is really in an interesting situation at this point. It's either this indictment will hurt the leadership and you'll see some jostling in a power vacuum, or it's going to decimate the family at some point, only because if the FBI can't get what they want this time, believe me, they're coming with indictments and large indictments. This isn't going to be like simple Medicaid fraud, medical fraud. This is going to be massive RICO, racketeering, conspiracy, murder charges. This is going to be the whole thing. So hold your hats. It's going to get kind of interesting as far as Philadelphia goes. And as the trial moves forward, the only way that I see Merlino taking a plea, which I don't see that at this point, is if they offer like a 2-year deal. He'll take that to be done with it because he can essentially go to prison, come out, and just regain control again. But there's no way Joey's going to do a 20-year term. He knows that's the end of his reign if that's what happens. So he's going to roll the dice. And I think that the evidence would suggest more than not that Joey's going to walk. The government doesn't have a strong case, and so we'll see what happens. But it's getting more and more interesting with each passing day. So that's pretty much what's going on in Philadelphia. Other than that, I've been getting a lot of emails about whatever court hearing I was in. I can't discuss it. I won't discuss it. It's as simple as that. Just as a gentleman's agreement that I agreed to, I'm just not going to get into details. However, like I said, that other thing with something that was said about me in court, it was just sort of funny, so I just figured I would add it. That's not going to get me in any trouble. It's like ridiculous and bullshit and crazy lies. But anyway, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Carmine the Snake Persico. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are talking about Carmine the Snake Persico today. Carmine is still alive. He's in his 80s. He's in Butner FCI down in Carolina on the medical ward just because he's old and stuff like that. But he's doing well from what I understand, and in good spirits as well as somebody could be. Carmine Persico was born in Brooklyn in 1933. He grew up in Carroll Gardens and Red Hook. By 16, he drops out of school, and he ends up becoming the leader of the Garfield Boys, which is a Brooklyn street gang. In 1951, at age 17, Carmine was arrested for beating another kid to death in Prospect Park. Charges would eventually be dropped in that case, but at 17 years old, he commits his first murder. There are some that saying he did it prior to that, but everything that I know says that the first murder came when he was 17 years old. And also in 1951, Carmine was recruited by the Profaci crime family, essentially by Frank Abitamarco. Carmine, at that point, sort of begins to loan shark a little bit, bookmake, and ends up leading into hijackings, home evasions, burglaries, and etc. And he ends up sort of forming a friendship with Joey Gallo, Albert Gallo, and Larry Gallo. Now, that friendship, obviously, as we know as we go forward, wasn't going to last very long. But for the premise of 1951 through, 57, pretty much 51 through the 60s, Persico was pretty close with the Gallo brothers. But that friendship, obviously, did not last. In 1957, Carmine Persico took part in the murder of Albert Anastasia. Essentially, at that point, Carlo Gambino realizes that in his 40s, by 1957, he's in his 40s, he realizes that Albert Anastasia is a little loose. He can't trust him, and he also realizes that he's never going to become boss. Albert Anastasia could essentially run the family, and Carlo would be 70, mid-60s, before he gets an opportunity to run his own crime family. And Carlo Gambino was a snake in the grass, essentially, and there was no way that he was going to wait. He would have ended up being an underboss throughout the rest of his career, and that's not what he wanted. He wanted full control, and the only way to kind of do that was to sort of align himself with Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese didn't like Albert Anastasia. Vito Genovese wanted everything to himself. He wanted to do boss of bosses. So he sort of gets with Carlo and he says, here's the deal. We take out Anastasia. You take over the family. You change the name to the Gambino crime family. In return, when I do what I need to do, I'm going to take over my own family. I'm going to be boss of bosses. And so Gambino kind of lets Vito Genovese think, okay, I'm all right with that. And so eventually Genovese and Gambino go to Joe Profaci, and they effectively discuss the issue with him as far as murdering Anastasia. Profaci goes along and says, I got a guy that can handle this. And what ends up happening is Profaci gives the order to Carmine Persico, who gets the murder contract on Anastasia and brings in Joey and the Gallo brothers in the hit as well. Nobody was actually charged with the Anastasia hit. It's still considered an open case, but it's well known that Albert Anastasia was at the Park Sheridan Hotel. He's sitting there getting a shave. 3 men walk in, those 3 men being Joey Gallo, Larry Gallo, and Carmine Persico, and they fill him with lead, and that's the end of Albert Anastasia, and shortly after, Carlo Gambino takes over. Later in the 1950s, both Persico and the Gallos begin to have a beef with the Profacis. And effectively what the issue was is that Joe Profaci was a penny pincher, a nickel pincher. He asked for an absolutely exorbitant rate from his soldiers and his capos. He continued to get richer while everyone else sort of starved. It's sort of almost to the point of like what Paul Castellano did with his men, although Profaci was a little more iron-fisted and wanted more money than most. And he wanted large tributes, and the problem was guys were starting to drown on the street. They couldn't make money, and so at some point, it's sort of the general feeling that Persico and the Gallos are like, this guy's too greedy, we're starving, and eventually this guy's got to go. And eventually those type of thoughts would lead to the first Colombo War. The first Colombo War officially begins on November 4th, 1959, and it's basically a back-and-forth kind of problem, and it really starts when Profaci's soldiers gun down Persico's mentor, Frank Abitamarco. The minute that they kill Abitamarco, Persico loses his shit. Not only does Persico lose his shit, but the Gallos lose their shit, because now this guy's killing... you have a mob boss killing his own members of his crime family over disagreements, which is understood, but it really sort of caused a split in the Colombo crime family. And the thing about this is this happened 3 times. This wasn't just a one-time deal. There were 3 different wars. And if efficiently, or not officially, but in respect to Abitamarco, he stopped paying Profaci tribute. He stopped paying the money. And what effectively ends up happening is he goes to to Carmine Persico and the Gallows and says, look, we're all starving. I'm not paying this guy what he wants. This is ridiculous. We're starving. So the Gallows, Larry Albert, and Joey and Carmine Persico say to Abbott and Marco, we fully support you, don't worry. Unfortunately for Abbott and Marco, he gets whacked. You move down the line a little bit further, and Carmine Persico and the Gallo brothers realize they're going to have a problem. They can't essentially fight on their own. They're going to need other people to get involved. And effectively, Tommy Lucchese from the Lucchese crime family and Carlo Gambino encouraged and supported the upheaval of Profaci. They felt that Profaci was weak. They didn't like the fact that he was so close to Joe Bonanno, who was causing problems with them. And so Carlo Gambino and Lucchese thought, if we support Gallows and Persico to overthrow Profaci, it's going to be better for everybody involved. And so, especially, one of the other facets to this is after Abbott and Marco is killed, naturally the succession of the rackets would go to the Gallows or to Carmine Persico. But what Profaci does, because he's a greedy prick, is he effectively takes away all the rackets that Abbott and Marco was running and didn't give them to the Gallows, didn't give them to Persicos, kept them for himself, added that to his piggy bank and to his profits, which really, really, really said, okay, now we got a problem. And it further infuriated the Gallows and Carmine Persico. In 1961, what the Gallows end up doing in response to that is they kidnap Profaci underboss Joe Magliacco, and they end up kidnapping a captain in the crime family you would know as Joe Colombo. Essentially, for weeks, they negotiate back and forth, and eventually an agreement is reached, and the Gallows say, all right, Joe Magliacco, you can go. Joe Colombo, you're free to go. Not a problem. But 6 months later, Profaci reneges on the deal, and the Gallows say, fuck this, we're going to war again. However, Profaci realizes something very important. He realizes that chances are that Gambino and Lucchese are against him. He realizes that Persico, of the group between Persico and the Gallows, that Persico really is probably the more sophisticated, the more intelligent, the more probably intelligent, maybe not as violent, as willing. He was willing to be as violent, but I think he realized that Persico could be bent. And effectively what Profaci does is he goes to Carmine Persico and he says, look, here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you a piece of all of these lucrative rackets, but what I really need you to do is I need you to switch sides. Persico is okay with that because he doesn't really give a shit about the Gallows. The ends justified the means for a long time with the Gallo brothers. However, he decides, you know what, okay, I'll definitely do that. One, he already knows Profaci at some point is going to go. He's going to try to align himself to take over some sort of leadership role at some point, and he realizes in order to do that, the Gallows have got to go. So it was a very, very snake move, and that's where he gets actually the nickname Carmine the Snake, because he effectively was with the Gallo brothers and turned his back on them. And there's a scene in The Godfather where Clemenza, or is it Frank? No, it's Frank Pantangeli walks into the bar, and he comes in to meet with the Rosado brothers, and he's choked from behind. And I think it's Danny Aiello's character who says, Michael Corleone says hello. That was literally stolen from a real-life event, and I'm going to tell you about that event right here. In 1961, Persico arranges to meet with Larry Gallo at the Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn to pretty much discuss the ongoing war, the strategies, and what they can do to effectively take out Profaci. What Larry does not realize is that effectively Carmine has switched sides. When Larry enters the bar, Persico's men begin to strangle Gallo with a garrote. But lucky for Gallo, a police officer strolled in, and he pretty much sees what's going on, which forced Persico and his men to sort of flee the bar. And that's officially how Carmine gets his nickname. Later that year, he ends up getting indicted for attempted murder on Larry Gallo, but Larry Gallo does what many men of honor did in those days, and he refuses to testify against Carmine Persico. So in June 1962, sort of Carmine Persico and the Gallos sort of get a reprieve because Joe Profaci dies of cancer. And effectively what ends up happening is Joe Magliocco was named boss. And the war continues, because Magliocco was exactly like Joe Profaci. Carlo Gambino also, and as well Tommy Lucchese, didn't like Magliocco. They thought he was like a clone, a carbon copy of what they already had, and they didn't want him there either. However, they were willing to sit by and see what would happen. In 1963, the Gallos end up bombing Carmine Persico's car, but he escapes with injuries. Carmine Persico, there were so many hits on Carmine Persico, it wasn't even funny. He ended up getting shot in the face, the shoulder, and living. The Gallos were out to get Persico after he backstabbed them, and they weren't going to stop. In May of 1963, Gallo gunmen ambushed Persico at the Gowanus section of Brooklyn. What ends up happening is Carmine Persico's in a car, Gowanus section of Brooklyn. A panel truck pulls up alongside Carmine Persico, and two gunmen shoot Carmine Persico in the face twice, then in the shoulder. And it's alleged, and it's sort of historical, that due to being shot in the face, Carmine Persico looks down and spits the bullet out in his hand. That's a lot of legend, but it's not war. It's absolutely true. He ends up surviving, but not long after, he's arrested and convicted of extortion charges, which effectively probably saves Carmine Persico's life. They were out to kill him. I don't know too many people who can survive a car bombing and survive getting shot in the face twice and the shoulder once. But at the end of the day, had he not gotten arrested and convicted of extortion, Carmine Persico probably would have been killed. Then there's a little second thing that happens, and what that is effectively a few months later, Joey Gallo also gets arrested and incarcerated. So that effectively sort of ended the war for the most part at that point, and effectively rendered Magliocco sort of the winner of the war, even though the war was far from over. By the 1960s, Persico is up to a capo, and he's back on the streets, and he's involved in labor racketeering, extortion, gambling, hijacking, murder for hire. And his crew was literally the most profitable crew in the entire Colombo crime family. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue with Carmine the Snake Persico. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are talking about the one and the only Carmine Persico. In 1968, Carmine Persico gets convicted on federal hijacking charges after 5 separate trials dating back all the way to 1960. On January 27th of 1971, he finally gets sentenced to prison for 8 years. And believe it or not, Joe Valachi was the single informant who testified against him. If you've heard of Joe Valachi before, he's the one that basically ratted out the entire mob, the first real big informant to ever come out. He just look up Joe Valachi. You'll see enough about him. But yeah, it was due to Joe Valachi that Carmine Persico ends up doing another stint. In February of 1971, Joey Gallo gets released. And why that's important is for the following reason. Joey Gallo had sort of insulated himself in prison with African-American gangs, and he realizes that the only way to sort of prosper when he gets out is to sort of organize a lot of these black street gangs. Not only can he import heroin, can he move drugs, but he can have a crew of hundreds. And while that might have been an interesting and somewhat smart move on his behalf, because you can go all the way back to Luciano. Luciano always said that it was better for everybody to get along and work under one umbrella than to fight each other. Didn't matter whether you were Jewish, Italian, Polish, or what, black, white, Chinese. A gangster's a gangster, and it's better that we all work together than against each other. And so Joey Gallo sort of has a problem. Joe Colombo, at this point, is the boss of the Colombo crime family. And Joe Colombo's doing a bunch of different things. Joe Colombo is on this anti-Italian mafia kick, and it's drawing a lot of attention. But before that kind of happens, Joey Gallo goes to Joe Colombo when he gets out of prison and says, listen, before I went away, certain territories sort of belong to me. I want to get those back. I want to be able to make more money. And Joe Colombo effectively tells him to fuck off. You're a scumbag. You're a nobody. You're a nothing. I don't want anything to do with you. You're not going to earn. And so Joey Gallo effectively decides that Joe Colombo's got to die. He's not going to tolerate it. He's not going to put up with it. And so things are going to get kind of nasty. And it doesn't help that effectively Joe Colombo is going to start his anti-Italian American bullshit or pro-Italian American stuff, which drew the ire of the whole entire commission. He wouldn't shut up. He's a mob boss, and he just won't shut up, and he's organizing these parades, and it's just starting a real fucking problem for the rest of the mob. But anyway, on November 11th, 1971, Persico goes on trial for 37 counts of extortion, coercion, conspiracy, which all stemmed from a loan sharking operation out of a Manhattan fur shop. December 8th, a jury acquits him of all charges. All 12 prosecution witnesses said they couldn't recognize Persico. That's not him. So they got scared. I would imagine there's probably a bribe involved in that. But he walks away from 37 counts of extortion, which technically, once again, Carmine Persico is the guy, like the cat with 9 lives. He gets shot. A car bomb he walks away from. He walks away from getting shot in the face twice. He walks away from 37 counts of extortion, racketeering, conspiracy. That would have been enough to put him away for the rest of his life as well. But as we see, Carmine Persico gets acquitted of all charges. Anyhow, Joe Colombo ends up getting shot, and the person that shot Joe Colombo was Joey Gallo. It's also been rumored that Carmine Persico was in on that himself. I don't want to sort of go that direction because I have another theory on that, and I know a little more information than that. But effectively, Carlo Gambino wanted Joe Colombo gone. He tried to explain to Joe Colombo a million times to keep it calm, stop doing what he's doing. Colombo wouldn't listen, so effectively Gambino goes to Joey Gallo and says, kill him. Joey Gallo effectively is the one who killed Joe Colombo. However, there was an African-American journalist who was sort of charged with that. He was shot and killed. He was essentially a patsy. This was Joey Gallo's move. And I'm sure that Gambino sort of sweetened the deal by saying, if he goes, you guys are back on the streets, you can make money. Carlo Gambino was very Machiavellian in everything that he did. So as a result, Colombo gets shot. Joe Iacovelli becomes boss, but he's very weak, and he really can't keep control. And effectively what ends up happening is Carmine Persico just sort of thrusts himself as boss, and he ends up taking over. And one of the first things he does when his trial ends in 1971 is he orders the death of Joey Gallo and his brothers. On April 7th, 1972, Joey Gallo is killed by Frank Sheeran coming out of, well, actually he gets shot inside, but he died on the pavement outside of Umberto's Clam House, celebrating his birthday. First of all, Carlo Gambino wanted Joey gone. He was reckless as well. They really needed somebody in that they could somewhat trust to some sort of extent. And so it was effective for Joey to go. He needed to go. Frank Sheeran was the guy that killed him. A lot of people have speculated other, but the truth is that Frank Sheeran walked into Umberto's Clam House, popped Joey Gallo. Joey Gallo stumbles out into the street. Frank pops him 2 more times. End of story. Joey Gallo is dead. And that sort of subsides some of the problem. In 1973, Persico ends up going to prison again for hijacking and loan sharking. And effectively, as he enters prison, his brother Ali is getting out of prison, and after a 17-year stretch. So effectively, Carmine says, "You know what? Here's what we're going to do, Ali. You take over as boss, and you'll get support from Gennaro Langella and Teddy Persico. So my brother Teddy will help you. Jerry Lang will help you out. You have the support." So he lets his brother take over as boss, because that way he still can remain very much in control of the crime family. In 1979, Carmine Persico gets released from prison. Then in 1984, Carmine and the rest of the Colombo leaders were indicted on racketeering charges, a part of the Colombo trial. After the indictment was announced, Carmine takes off. He flees. He runs and tries to hide. The FBI begins a manhunt, and effectively, what Carmine did was he went out and hid at his cousin's house in Hempstead, New York. And his cousin obviously was Fred DeChristopher. But what Carmine didn't know at the time was DeChristopher was an informant and had been for 2 years, going back to a previous sting operation. He was giving up all kinds of information. He effectively gives Carmine up, tells the FBI the location of where Carmine's hiding. Then on February 15, 1985, the FBI arrests Carmine Persico. Once again, Carmine Persico should go away for the rest of his life. July 2nd, 1986, he was indicted with the 5 family bosses, with a second set of racketeering charges as a part of the commission trial. According to Greg Scarpa, both John Gotti and Carmine wanted to kill Rudy Giuliani, but the commission refused to sanction it. Now, here's the thing. The one thing, and we're going to get into Vic Orena and a bunch of other people, because there's going to be a problem, especially with Carmine Sessa coming down the pool a little bit. But one of the things is that Greg Scarpa was playing both sides. He was playing the FBI side, the Carmine Persico side, and he would get in on the Orena side at one point, telling him stuff too. Scarpa played all his bases sort of correctly, but he was a snitch. But the idea that John Gotti would get involved in killing Giuliani over the commission trial is a little bit absurd. If Gotti had any beef with Giuliani, it would come, right around that time period because of his own trials and stuff like that. So the idea that Greg Scarpa was telling the truth when he said Gotti and Persico got together to say, hey, let's kill Giuliani, and then they take it to the commission, and the commission says, absolutely not. Are you fucking out of your mind? I mean, that's ridiculous. You can't kill a public official. I don't buy it. I don't buy it because it came out of Greg Scarpa's mouth. Greg Scarpa was not a truth teller. He was a liar and a rat, and that's the honest truth. But he was a tough guy at the same point. We're not going to take that away from him. As the commission trial gets underway, Carmine Persico decides to defend himself and act as his own attorney. One of the problems with this is he is highly bright, But when you don't know laws and you don't know how to do certain things, you're going to get caught up and indict yourself. And effectively, his co-defendants get crazy with it, saying, Carmine, what are you doing? You're going to get us all arrested. And Persico ends up, while cross-examining prosecution witnesses, he ends up admitting involvement in criminal activities, which effectively rendered him a criminal, which effectively would render him a convicted member of the mafia. And June 14th, 1986, Persico gets convicted in the Colombo racketeering trial, which was the first part of the trial. He was sentenced to 39 years for that. Then on November 19th, just 2 days later, he and the other heads of the 5 families, with the exception of the Gambinos because Paul Castellano got killed, were convicted in the commission case, and he was sentenced to 100 years. So he gets 139 years in prison and 2 different trials. That effectively would render like I was saying, it would render a mob boss pretty much persona non grata at that point, but not Carmine. Carmine was not going to sit back and take that lightly, and he would still continue to run a crime family from behind the wall. In June of 1987, while he is in prison, Persico ordered acting boss at the time, Joel Kakakshe, to kill lawyer William Ehrenwald, who was a retired prosecutor who allegedly was disrespectful to the mafia. He had said a lot of nasty stuff, so pretty much Persico orders Kakakshe to kill Ehrenwald. Kakakshe ends up hiring hitmen who effectively fuck up the hit, and they end up killing Ehrenwald's father, George, instead. The commission was absolutely beside themselves, angry about it, so Kakakshe hired 2 more hitmen to kill the other 2 hitmen, and then following that, Kakakshe himself actually killed the other 2. So 2 hitmen were hired to kill Ehrenwald. They screwed up, so the commission gets mad. Kakakshe kills those 2 hitmen, and then the second set of hitmen that he hired to do it, he killed them as well. Following that, Kakakshe himself in 2004 pled guilty to the Ehrenwald murder, but no charges were filed against Carmine Persico at all, so he gets sort of away with ordering a hit on a prosecutor, and ultimately Kakakshe goes away to jail and gets a life sentence. But Carmine wants to keep leadership, so what he does is he names his son Alley Boy Persico the boss. And Alley Boy eventually gets arrested and sort of skips out on bail and goes into hiding. So Persico then forms a 3-headed panel boss structure. In 1988, he dissolves the 3-boss structure and names Vic Orena boss. Orena could induct members and commit murders and essentially order murders, but at the end of the day, Persico made it clear that he was only going to be boss until his son gets released from prison. Then in 1991, Orena sort of gets tired of the leadership. It's sort of back and forth. He really doesn't have any control over the family. He realizes that this is pretty much all about Carmine's son, Alley Boy. And he sort of just doesn't want to give up family leadership. You know, it's all or nothing. Here I am running this family for Carmine. I'm on the streets. Carmine's in prison, and I'm supposed to do this till your son gets out. No, I'm not going to do it. And so Orena slowly starts to feel out what his options are. And he ends up discussing the matter with John Gotti, and John Gotti agrees that Orena should essentially attempt to take over. Then in the spring of 1991, Orena goes to his consigliere, Carmine Sessa, to sort of poll all the capos in the family of whether or not they wanted him as boss or Carmine Persico as boss. Orena really believed that he sort of had enough power and clout with capos that if they supported him, then they could take that support and officially go to the commission, and that the commission would recognize effectively recognize Orena and not Persico. The problem is that Sessa went right back and told Carmine Persico what was going on. Persico, of course, is furious and then wants Vic Orena killed. Then on June 20th, Carmine Sessa takes a 5-man hit team, and they park outside of a street adjacent to Arena's house. And as Orena is driving down the street, he sort of recognizes everybody in the car and takes off. And then for the next several months following that, Persico and Orena sort of engage in peace negotiations, which is oversaw by the commission. Ultimately, the commission didn't want to side with either one of them. This was a Colombo problem. They had enough problems with the commission case. The mob was sort of in tatters at that point. They didn't want to get involved, and effectively a third Colombo War would begin. On October 18th, 1991, William Cotolo sent a hit team to try and kill Greg Scarpa. By the end of 91, the two Persico factions, that being Persico and Orena, traded murder for murder. Law enforcement was outraged by this entire thing, and they ended up throwing a ton of money into prosecuting the Colombo crime family, which ultimately would end up resulting in 68 indictments, 58 convictions, and 10 mobsters would turn into informants. Now, one of the things we have to go back to, Bill Cotolo Sr., who was also called Wild Bill, essentially wanted to kill Greg Scarpa. The reason why is because Scarpa was playing all sides of this war. Scarpa was effectively doing what Persico told him, then going back and telling Orena things. Then he would go back and tell Persico things that were absolute lies just to infuriate it. I think Greg Scarpa was probably doing this as a result of, one, he was an FBI informant, and two, I believe that he really wanted control of the family. And the way that he could do that was by manipulating both sides. And if both sides are going to end up fighting each other over this, then essentially Scarpa could sit back, watch the casualties fall, and end up taking over. But as a result of William Cotolo trying to kill Scarpa, Cotolo was ultimately killed himself, and for good reason. And so moving forward in 1992, Orena was convicted of racketeering and murder and was sentenced to life in prison, which effectively would give control right back to Carmine Persico yet again. The cat with 9 lives continues to roll. With the war ended, Persico effectively wants to restructure the crime family at this point. He ends up installing another ruling panel with his brother Teddy, Joe Bonanza, and Joe Tomasello. Then in 1994, when Andrew Russo gets released from prison, Persico disbands the panel and he makes Russo boss. So all along he sort of had this idea, and it's almost an exact carbon copy of what he did with his son Alley Boy. He effectively waited till somebody else came out, disbands the ruling panel, and then names someone else boss. Then in 1996, Russo ends up going to prison, and Persico replaces him with his son, who has just been released from prison, Alley Boy Persico. So once again, we see the same sort of thing. I'm going to have a ruling panel. I'm going to name this guy boss. I trust him better. But when my son gets out, I'm going to hand it to him, which caused a lot of discontent in the Colombo crime family. Then, in 1999, Alley Boy Persico is once again indicted, so Persico makes Kakashi boss. Persico orders Bill Cotolo's murder on behalf of Greg Scarpa. He finds out that Bill Cotolo not only is sort of trying to undermine Carmine Persico, but he's actually trying to make a run at the top. And by trying to kill Greg Scarpa, that was a sign to Carmine Persico that Bill Cotolo had to go. And so effectively, Persico realizes that Cotolo is starting to take a run, and he wants to put a stop to it as quick as he can. And effectively, Persico has him killed, and he was end up buried in Long Island. They didn't find his body for years later. Then in 2001, Carmine Persico's son, Alley Boy Persico, ends up getting a life sentence, and that effectively ended the son from running a family. And still to this day, Carmine Persico runs the Colombo crime family. He's been one of the only bosses that effectively has remained control of the crime family. If you look just at his age, other than Sonny Frances, Carmine is a living legend. He's a snake in the grass, of course. We've discussed that. But one of the things that I think really sticks home, and we have to talk about Greg Scarpa for a minute. Greg Scarpa, for all intents and purposes here, was really responsible for the Colombo War. He played all sides against one another in hopes that he could take over. I really think that's ultimately what his objective was. He fed the FBI a lot of bullshit information, but he also fed them good information, enough so that those indictments, at least the 58 convictions that they were to get out of the 68 indictments, was pretty good. And the fact that I think Greg Scarpa knew that Bill Cotolo was eventually going to, he was coming into power and rising to power, and Scarpa couldn't have that. And an easy way of dealing with that, especially after Cotolo took a shot at Scarpa, was to tell Carmine Persico. And Persico ends up ordering the death, which sort of takes Scarpa out of the mix as far as killing another made man, so to speak. It sort of gave the green light for that to happen. And I think at the end of the day, Scarpa really thought he was going to end up the guy in charge of the Colombo crime family. And I really do believe, regardless, if Scarpa hadn't have been an FBI informant, right, I don't think he would have given the family back to Persico. I think he would have effectively taken over complete control, and I think Persico would have been effectively neutered and wouldn't have been able to run the crime family anymore. And that's sort of the way it went. But as we see, Carmine Persico, early in his youth, murders somebody at 17. He probably should have been put away for life for that. Gets away with that. Gets indicted many different times. Does a couple of stretches. But this guy had 9 lives, and he was incredibly smart. He was incredibly brutal as well. But the one thing that I think I can say from at least a street perspective, that what Carmine's problem was that as a boss, you sit to the side, and he didn't. He was in the streets, bookmaking in the streets, doing what he had to do, wasn't afraid to use murder to enhance what he needed to get across. And I think he picked very stubborn leaders and very unintelligent leaders. And I think anytime you take somebody from your crew and you install them as a boss with the sort of statement that, oh, well, you're not really boss, this is just to hold the family over until my son gets out, that kind of creates a problem, and it creates a split in the factions, and that's exactly why you see the wars. And you can even go back to the Joey Gallo thing, and even Carmine Persico back then, when Carmine's with Joey Gallo to take out Anastasia, does what he needs to do to align himself, and then turns on the Gallos. So Carmine, to say that he was sneaky is sort of an understatement. Snake is exactly the word we use. But as far as Carmine goes as a human being, and I'll give you something outside the box here, away from sort of the mob. I have, throughout my life, communicated with Carmine Persico. He's a very nice guy. I'm not in any way, shape, or form admonishing for whatever he's allegedly done. But what I can tell you is that he is highly intelligent, a very nice guy, and in fact, I think one of the arguments that was recently made was that when he was convicted in the commission trial, technically he really wasn't the boss. And they charged him with those crimes. Sort of the same thing that happened to Tony Salerno. Tony Salerno was a front boss for the Genovese crime family, and technically Vincent Gigante was the boss. The FBI realized this while the commission case was going on, but they weren't about to stop and reverse themselves and say, wait, Tony Salerno isn't the boss. So Tony Salerno gets a 100-year sentence for really something he wasn't. The same can be said for Carmine Persico. At the time, he may have been calling shots, but he was not the active boss on the streets. That much is definitely known, and I know that recently his family and he have filed appeals with the courts over this matter, but of course they fell on deaf ears per the usual, because had he only gotten the 39-year sentence from the first set of the Colombo racketeering trial, he'd have gotten 39 years. He would have been out already. He would have effectively been out, I believe, this year, or between the last 5 and 7 years, he would have been out. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, you look at his rise to power, and his rise to power was by being a snake. And a lot of people have said to me, offhandedly about this, that, guy was treacherous. He was just as treacherous as Carlo Gambino. He was just as treacherous as Vinny the Chin Gigante. The one difference is that once Vinny Gigante took over, once Carlo Gambino officially took over, they sort of shut it down. They insulated themselves incredibly well, put front bosses out, And the problem is, and I can say this in knowing him, Carmine's mistake was allowing himself to be there. He should have insulated himself a little bit better, and he didn't. He probably shouldn't have defended himself in court if he had appropriate legal representation. And I believe the judge on that case was on record as saying he's highly intelligent. It's such a shame you were a gangster. Had he had appropriate legal representation, he might have been able to walk from that. But as we've seen when we tell these stories, is that you only can go for so long before it catches up to you. And so for the guy that had 9 lives, in the end he didn't. And he ended up getting 139 years as a result. Probably a light sentence when you consider everything that's been alleged. But that's the story of Carmine the Snake Persico. He's still alive, still kicking, still running the Colombo crime family from behind the wall, and I don't think that's ever going to change. And that's the one thing that I think you should take from this, is that when most guys who get a large sentence would have, dialed it back and handed the family to somebody else and said, I've had enough, I'm going to serve a ton of time, he didn't. He's refused to. He's in the pocket of it, and there has to be some sort of I don't want to say like honor necessarily, but there has to be some respect for a guy that tells you who he is. This is what he's going to do. He's not going to stop. Fuck the system. I'm just going to keep running my crime family. Had he just been a little smarter in terms of insulating himself, this story may change. Now, if we even go back to when the Gallos shot him twice in the face and in the shoulder and the drive-by, if Carmine gets killed, what happens to the Colombo crime family past that? And it was a question that I got asked a couple of weeks ago in the Q&A, was if Carmine had gone to prison earlier or had been killed, what would the effects have been? And I think the effect probably would have been maybe that Greg Scarpa doesn't turn informant and he becomes maybe de facto leader at some point. I think we can make a definite argument that Bill Catolo would have been running the Colombo crime family. But for whatever the reason, Carmine escaped hit after hit after hit, escaped charge after charge after charge, and the Colombos kind of ended up the way they did. A very, very interesting human being, very smart, very eloquent, very well-spoken, very kind, very giving personality, but there's also the other side to that coin, and that's the side that we talk about here, and that's Carmine Persico. I wish I could have covered just a little bit more because there's one kind of big story I wanted to tell, but for the sake of time and energy, et cetera, that's essentially the way that Carmine is, the Carmine was. He's never going to stop, and he's one of the last of a generation that doesn't exist anymore. You go back into the history of the mob, and we can argue whether he was respectful and honorable as far as that kind of nostalgia goes, but he's the last of a dying breed that no longer exists. Sonny Francaise being the other one, and if that guy ever talked, my God, the amount of just sheer stories coming out of his mouth would be absolutely insane. But that was Carmine Persico. Next week, we're going to come back with an all-new show. You can follow us over on Twitter at RealMobTalk7. Type in Mob Talk Radio in YouTube. Pick us up there. Over on Facebook at Mob Talk Radio as well. I wanted to thank everybody for listening in, everybody for submitting questions from earlier. Have a great weekend. Stay warm. It's going to be a little chilly. And be safe on Halloween. There's always nutcases and shit running around. So anyway, enjoy your week. Enjoy the holiday. And we will see you next week.